All right, guys, I think we're live. Tonight we have our next installment, if you will, of Conversations with Commodores. And I've got my buddy who everybody here knows, Luke Wyatt. How you doing, my friend?
Great, Bernard. It's great to be here tonight.
It's good to see you and Julie and have a good little talk for a few minutes. So thank you for making some time. I know you'd rather be at the SEC tournament for the last night that I think the public can go.
No
We're
kidding.
sitting in the Hawk right now where Vandy's putting it on Toledo. I've been watching the game for a while. But thank you for having some time with us. I think this will be a fun conversation, a good little trip down memory lane.
Glad to do it. Glad to do it.
Excellent, excellent. For those of you who don't know, and I can't imagine there being anybody who watches this evening, hasn't had interactions, good, bad, or otherwise. It depends on what you did right or wrong during Luke's tenure. But Luke has been part of the Vanderbilt football program for 4 decades, starting as a kid, ball boy in the 70s during the Steve Sloan era. And we're going to start back there in just a second. Luke, coming all the way to 2018, all those bowl games, all those future pros, all those coaches, my gosh, and guys who went into the pros and provosts. And you have seen it and done it and been there for all of that, all those years. So I want to, before we get to start talking, Luke, I want to just say congratulations for the career that you've had, all the guys you have influenced, the great times that I'm sure you've had, and we're going to get into some of those. Some of the times I'm sure weren't as great as other times, but through it all, you've been there. So thank you for all that you've done for the Commodores and the program for over 40 years.
Well, thank you. And, I started out as a kid, and just to give you a little bit of background on that, when I started in the 70s, Bill Kelly was nice enough. My dad owned a store in Nashville, and he was nice enough to let me come in.
Wait, Luke. Do you realize what you just said? Bill Kelly was nice enough. For those of us who knew Kelly over the years, that's a tough sentence. I applaud that. It's being recorded. So thank you for saying that. But now you can go on. Bill Kelly was nice enough
to let me attend some practices. There was a guy named Bill Stewart. I don't know if you remember Bill, but he worked there as well. And they allowed me just to hang around. I don't know if you know this. I had souvenir sales. I had program sales. I had a group. Jody Jones was a program sailor for me when he was a little kid. So it's pretty neat stories.
Yeah.
But worked for 11 different coaches over my time period, 6 athletic directors, and several operation guys. So it was a great ride. Let me just say that.
Well, I know that if there's anybody who bleeds the black and gold, it's this man right here. If anybody has ever doubted him, I doubt you've ever owned or put on another shirt from another SEC institution, unless it was a bet that you may have lost, or you may have been asleep and somebody did it as a prank. But
there you go.
Luke, let's talk about how old were you when you first started having any involvement with the program? What are your first memories of that?
Well, in the 70s, my dad owned a store in Nashville on Music Row, and he would take me in because he'd go in at night to run the store and close it up and do the books and everything. It's like a market. He owned a market on what is now, I guess, Music Square East or something like that. Okay. So he would drop me off at practice, and I would get in everybody's way, just whatever, hand out towels, whatever, just whatever they could do. Like Dennis Harrison.
How old were you? How old
13,
were you?
13.
Okay.
Dennis Harrison was one of the first players that ever spoke to me. Scared me to death. Man. Dennis was a monster. Here I am, a little kid, So Dennis was probably my first athlete that I was like in awe of. And then later on,
we all were.
Yeah, exactly. And then it went from that to help. Bill Stewart got me the job working on game days where I could be on the field and also run the concession stands. I had people that ran that, or not the concession, the souvenir stands and program sales. And then that just evolved into running balls during the game, moving on to 1983 to where I became a full-time employee.
And how old were you at that time?
Let's see. So I would have been 22, I guess it was, something like that.
So by that point, you had been part of the program for 9-10 years.
Right.
So you came on as a full-time employee.
Right.
Wow.
So it was awesome.
So during your high school and college years, you were still very active with the program?
Well, I didn't attend college. I was going to hopefully gone to Vanderbilt. And when I got there and started getting so excited about working in the department, I just took a job with Vanderbilt.
Wow.
So the college years didn't come. I
Right.
regret that only in one sense, that maybe I could have been the athletic director if I'd have gone to college.
Well, I can tell you, you'd have had a whole bunch of votes. That's for
Well,
sure.
thank
But
you. That's
but
kind.
you got more of an education, frankly, for all those years being involved in what you did and some of those things that you were
Yes, I
able
did.
to participate with. That we don't have those experiences. Most of the people who did your job or that type of job for other SEC institutions, I bet you never had those awesome life experiences that you've been able to do.
Well, you're right. You grow up quick when you're around athletics. Something real competitive. You learn. You're humbled at an early age. You find out what discipline is at an early age. Some things that I had in my home, but of course, it always helps to see it from a stranger in the outside world as well. And you're right. I grew up quick.
Well, what was it, Luke, about your first experiences about hanging around the program? Was there something unique about Vanderbilt, or was it just that you got to hang around college football? Or tell me
No, I
on there.
I loved sports from an early age. I can remember my dad letting me skip school when Hank Aaron was chasing the home run record
Oh,
when
wow.
in April 8th, 1974, or whenever it was, 73 maybe. But anyway, so I was a sports junkie. Collected the baseball cards, football cards, basketball cards. Played sports, of course, and where I grew up, Cheatham County, which is Ashland City, Tennessee, it was 90% Tennessee fans. So I realized Vanderbilt was right down the street. I lived near West Nashville in Ashland City, so I was 20 minutes from campus. And when I found out that my dad knew a guy named Bill Stewart, who was the marketing guy at the time, I'd go in and I met him at my dad's store. And he told him what a big Vanderbilt follower. I listened to all the games on the radio. You're too young to remember this, Bernard, but there was a man named Paul Eels that was doing the broadcast back then.
Okay.
And he was great. He had a catchphrase, "Holy smokes!" So I loved that.
Awesome.
And again, we also had success against Tennessee at that time because in 73 and 74 and 75, all those games came down to a punt, whether we won or lost.
Wow.
There's going to be some people that remember that. But yes, we had 3 straight years where it came down to a punt. We won one, lost one, and tied one with Tennessee in the mid 70s.
Well,
So,
you know that in the mid 70s and going into the late 70s, you had success in all the 3 major men's sports.
yes.
You had a bowl game with the football team. You had some pretty exciting basketball programs. And then you get closer to the end of the 70s, you had the Scotty Madison time period,
Yes.
which had some success. And Scotty went on to a 10-year, I think, pro baseball career. So there was all kind of good stuff going on in that little center of campus. Just like right now, the doors are breaking it open against Toledo. They're up. It's either 6-1 right now.
Good.
At home, and it's kind of a merry-go-round this inning. But that must have been some exciting times. And Luke, at that time, even when I was there in the 80s, you could go to a baseball game, and the Hawk wasn't the Hawk. It was barely better than a high school facility at the time. You could hit a foul ball and it go across Jess Neely and land in the parking lot. An inning later, I could just go pick it up. Or I could stand at the chain link fence and talk to Jim Schiffman in right field in between pitches. I mean, the program hadn't built up. My point being is, for the young fan like you were at the time, it must have been heaven to be able to interact with all of that, and particularly becoming employed.
Well, it really was. And I tell you, some of my great memories are of baseball, because when Roy Mubin was the head coach, I would sit in the dugout a lot of the games. And the games I didn't sit in the dugout, I don't know if you remember Tony Neely, who was the SID at the time for baseball. But we didn't really have a press box back then. We had a folding table with a little tent over us on the first base side and the third base side. I would do
there.
I would keep the scoreboard, and Tony Neely would do the PA and the books. So great memories. Yes, absolutely. And that
Well,
was the wooden bat era too. They used wooden bats back then.
it was. It was. Let's now come a little bit forward. You get hired in the mid to early 80s. That's a little bit before I came there in the fall of 86. And Bill Kelly, I assume, was the Lord and Master of the equipment room, and was all during my time there. So what was your first job for Bill, and what were your responsibilities when you came on board with the football program as a full-time Commodore?
Well, I remember my first day. And think, at the time I didn't care. I would do anything it was a dream come true just to be a full-time employee in the athletic department. I didn't care whether I was mopping the floors or what. Well, the first thing Bill had me do, we had just got in the new bales of towels, so I had to fold 1,300 towels. And it's so funny. I told Dwayne Jones this. And I told Dwayne Jones, I said, Dwayne, I'm not sure this gig's for me or not. I've got a rash under my neck where I'm holding the towels and folding them. And he said, hang in there. It'll get better. There's more fun coming. So Dwayne Jones kind of kept me going there to keep my spirits up.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to tag him and let him know we're talking about him right now. I'm surprised he must be busy right now at work, and otherwise he'd be on here. That's so good. So folding towels the very first day. Well, talk to me about what other. Oh, let me see here. David Kropp says, "Give Uncle Luke a big fat sloppy hello from me. He may go into McGugan Fund." David, I definitely will pass that. Just passed it on. Big laugh from Luke. I'm sure Luke has.
Tell Crop Duster hello.
Crop Duster, he says hello. We just got a double from Harrison Ray. Another one. They're now up 8-1, and it's
nice.
The circus just kind of merry-go-round. Well, Luke, that's your first memory. I'm sure it's still quite vivid of holding the towels, but you clearly had more responsibilities than that as time went on. During my time there in the mid to late 80s, you were, I assume, to be second in command to Bill and eventually succeeded Bill. But what people don't know, maybe some of the ball players or the other equipment assistants knew, is there's so much behind the scenes that gets done when the players are away from the facility. They're in class, they're sleeping, they're traveling, doing whatever. But you guys are there 40, 50, 60, 70 hours or more during the week. So for the people who don't know, let's talk about the off season, and then let's talk about during the season, a given week. So during the off season, we got workouts, we got meetings, lifting, all of that. What's a typical day for you guys in the equipment room?
Well, if you start in January, let's say winter conditioning. Back when in the 80s, it changed because you remember the old equipment cage. Before we moved into the new McGugan in '90, that's when I took over the equipment from Bill.
The year I graduated, that summer is when y'all did all that transition, I believe.
That's correct. And at that time, we had men's soccer that we serviced, along with baseball and football. So we had all three sports really. So in the winter, winter baseball would start their workouts as well as you guys lifting weights and running or whatever the conditioning you were doing at the time. So we had to be there bright and early because a lot of times one of the sports would work out early because we only had the one weight room. So our hours were still the same as they would be during the season. Myself or Bill would get there, one of the students, at, say, 5 in the morning, and we don't close it down till 10 at night. So winter conditioning was just as busy as in season in some respects.
It may have been more if you really, I'm thinking about, because the students, based on their schedules and their meeting times and lifting times, that it may have just been all staggered throughout the day, probably 6 days, maybe 7 days a week, depending on certain things going on.
Well, and as you know, Bernard, at Vanderbilt, you can't just get in and fog a mirror. You've got to go to work and you've got to go to class or you won't be there long.
That's right.
And so that's another thing. It wasn't like if you had a class, you went to class, then you worked out when you could.
Yeah. No, and I certainly get this. Russell Nichols says, Luke is the man, heart and soul of Vanderbilt. I totally agree with that, Russell.
Oh, Russ and his family are doing great. Last time I talked to Russ, I think he had 15 kids. No, just joking, but big family, love them, the great group of people.
Good deal. Well, thank you, Russ, for tuning in and your comment. Luke, let's move into the summertime. You got a whole bunch of student athletes on campus for various reasons. What's going on in the summertime with the student athletes and then preparing for the fall camp and season?
Okay, it changed over the years. When you were there, it wasn't quite as busy in the summer. The month of May, it was really, that's when you took your vacations, and then all the gear for the following year would start coming in. The reconditioned helmets and shoulder pads and all the cloth gear and the apparel and shoes would start coming in. So you're basically doing just like setting up a store, and you set up the store every year. So that was May, and then in June, July is when you typically did your summer conditioning. That was the tough stuff, you know. But for me, we always had lunch bunch basketball, which was great, in the old Magoogan, which is now a weight room for Olympic sports. I still call them Olympic sports, non-revenue, whatever they call them now.
Right.
But you know, it was just basically workouts. That's all it was during the summer. And then when August hit, we had to have everything ready for basically 185 people, because we had to take care of the coaches, the trainers, the weight staff, all their gear, and then, of course, getting the equipment for the players. So that was all of July we did that. Right after July 4th, there was no more days off.
And then, Luke, during my years there, we didn't go off campus for our camp. We stayed on campus. We had all practices. Everything
Right.
took place. But I know maybe in the early 90s, I'm not sure when it was, they started going out to Bell Buckle. So talk about that.
I will never forget that staff meeting, because that was the closest I ever came to taking another job. Jerry DiNardo had come into the fold. He replaced Coach Brown, and he said in the first staff meeting, he said, "Guys, I'm a big believer about isolation and getting these guys focused, getting them away from campus to get this thing turned around." The concept's good. I liked it. The first couple of years, it served its purpose. I'm not sure if you asked the guys that had to go to Bell Buckle whether they enjoyed it or not. It was really extreme circumstances. I mean, that was probably some of the most rigorous 2-a-days / sometimes 3-a-days that I'd ever seen. They had to shower. Where they showered was ankle deep in water. Only one set of girdles. Now, most people won't know what I'm saying. A girdle, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The thing you wore under with your pads. So you had to slide on a wet girdle every morning. Imagine that when 2-a-days started.
Yeah.
That got your day rolling at 5 a.m.
Nice.
So, you know, Bell Buckle was an experience. I'm glad, like I said, I came close to taking the Pittsburgh Steelers job that year, because I thought, I don't know if I want to do this, go away to Bell Buckle. I'm a home guy.
Well, I suspect that was the John Norwig influence.
It was.
Because Wig and Tim, remind me Tim's last name with his
Tim Bream.
Tim Bream. They were the head trainer and assistant during the years I was there, and then Wig took off for the Steelers, which I think he's now been there 30 years.
Oh, yeah, he has been a long time.
I knew.
And a friend of mine.
Go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. A friend of mine in the business, Tony Parisi, who was the head equipment manager at the Steelers then, was thinking about quitting, or had quit or something, had health problems. I'm not sure. And I had an opportunity to go interview with Mr. Rooney, and that was awesome. But, you know, and you can imagine. But then I thought, well, I love Vanderbilt. Nashville's my home. And it was the best decision I ever made, staying in college athletics.
Very good. Well, we're fortunate that you did make that decision. So, so Luke, what's your, regardless of the time of the year, what is your favorite time of the week dealing with the equipment responsibilities? Meaning, you understand where I'm going?
Yes.
What was something you really looked forward to doing each week or month?
My favorite day of the week for home weeks was always Fridays, because the hay was in the barn. You knew where you're playing. You had a game getting ready to happen the next day. Fridays were tough for us because it's dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's, making sure everybody's helmet's perfect, shoulder pads ready, everything's good to go. But it's that excitement of building up to the game on a Friday at home that I loved. On the road, it was more stressful because you had to move everything away. Basically, you take your whole show on the road. So we became like roadies for a rock band. You know, you got to have everything. You can't forget anything. And you know how it is as a player. certain players had to have certain things, and the little things, a certain wristband that someone would like. I know when Jay Cutler played there, I was the only one that could put air in his helmet, that type of thing. So the road was a little more stressful. Enjoyed the Friday nights with the Keystone Cops and all that, and all my road crew guys. But I would say Fridays at home, and then Friday nights on the road.
Excellent. Well, O.J. Fleming says to tell you what's up, Luke.
Tell him hello, and I hope he and Ellen are doing great.
Good fella, he sure is.
He is one of the best.
I was coming up there in a few weeks for a concert and some baseball, but all that's been postponed, just given the coronavirus issues. Hope to get to see you soon, OJ. Let's talk about the Keystone Cops. These guys, not the typical fan, the typical person who may be a casual observer of the program, has no idea what these awesome men have done for so long for the Vanderbilt program. And during my tenure, it was Billy Smith and his crew, and they were there, gosh, probably almost as long as you were there.
They were there longer than me in some respects. The three original Keystone Cops were Bobby Russell, Billy Smith, and Danny Gentry. They were the three originals. Later on, a guy named James Arundel replaced Danny Gentry when Danny couldn't do it any longer. That was in the 90s, I think, mid-90s. But anyway, those I think Bobby Russell in 1978, used to drive the former athletic director, Pete Naylor, to games because Pete had some health conditions and didn't like flying. So he would drive him, like he drove him all the way to Colorado Springs when we played at Air Force. So Bobby started then, and then they all started in 1979 driving the truck.
Well, by the time I came through in the mid 80s, they were in prime form.
Big time.
And now that the 18-wheeler gets loaded up on what day of the week, and talk about those away games. Let's just say it's the away game to Gainesville, Florida in the fall of '87.
Okay, let's think. Okay, well, the truck gets loaded Thursday, and we load everything except what you guys wore for practice. We'll take all the trunks, all the extra gear, all the coach's gear, all that goes on the truck Thursday morning. Then we'll go get lunch about midday. Then when you guys get off the field at practice, we'd round up your helmets, because back then you only had one set of helmets. You round up the helmets, your shoes, the pad bags, and that type of stuff, get them on the truck, and then we take off for the destination. Most of the time back then, you'd have a Friday walkthrough at the visiting stadium. So we might get on a long trip to Gainesville, if we didn't get out of there till say 7 at night, you get into Lake City or Ocala, wherever we were staying, check into our room, grab a couple hours sleep, and head back to the stadium in Gainesville.
So wait, Luke, the equipment truck, the 18-wheeler, is leaving Thursday night. And they're going to drive through the evening. Now, who's on that truck?
On that truck back then, it was a 26-foot box truck when you were playing. It moved to an 18-wheeler. I think we moved to 18-wheelers in the 90s. But on that truck was Bobby, Billy, and Danny, the three Keystone Cops. They drove the truck. And we would follow in vans back then. Then we moved to a bus. Mm-hmm. But we would follow in like 12-passenger vans.
Who's in the van? Who's following behind?
Well, back then it would be like Dwayne Jones, or if I didn't fly with the team, I might go with the vans, go early, and Bill would stay back and fly, every trip. But sometimes Bill would want me to stay for baseball or something, and then me fly with the team. So it just kind of depends. But mostly the managers and maybe a few other volunteers we had besides the policemen.
Okay, and they've got to get set up at the opposing stadium. So you're showing up at the stadium, you're meeting either your counterparts or you're meeting security at the stadium to let you guys do what you need to do?
Right. We would meet. Of course, we always had our maps back then. Now you just Google it. But back then, you know where the stadium was. Of course, you went to you know what section to go to for your visiting locker room.
Right.
And then we would normally your walkthroughs, you guys would fly in if it's a fly trip. So let's just say Florida for the example. If you guys would fly in, you would probably practice around 2 or 3 that afternoon. It takes approximately 4 hours to set up a locker room if you guys are just doing a walkthrough. So we would get there, say, at 10 after sleeping for 3 or 4 hours, set everything up, break it back down after the walkthrough, lock it up for the night, and return to the hotel on Friday
And then you
night.
still got to reset the locker room the next day. And if
Right.
it's an early game, how many hours before? If it's 11:30 kickoff, what time are you getting back there?
Well, we'd get there around 5 a.m.
Yeah.
Because I always like, the team would generally get there 2 hours before kickoff because the kickers would go out about an hour and 3 minutes before kickoff. That's the first group that usually went out, was the special teams. So we'd have to have everything ready before the team got there and the coaches got there. So a 5 a.m. for an 11:30 kickoff. And because you never want to put your uniforms out the night before. You keep them secured, because if someone happened to break into the locker room, they're going to want a helmet and a jersey. So we, most of the time, we just wait till game day to set all that up.
Well, I'm sure that comes with experience and wisdom over the years.
Yes, absolutely.
What was the most depressing or worst experience or unique experience or harrowing on away trips? I know that there was a plane flight maybe into Kansas or Oklahoma.
Yes.
That was horrible. That was a few years before me. What are some of those experiences that you recall that really come to mind?
Well, the flight you're talking about to Lawrence, Kansas, was one of the. We were running out of fuel, and they had to land, and the plane was doing this number. I don't know if you can see me on the, but the plane was, but we had to land it, and I know Bill Kelly's wife, Glenda, when we got off the plane, Bill's arm was bleeding because she had dug her nails into his arm because we had to land the plane, and she was pretty stressed about that. That's one of them that I certainly remember. One year we were in Miami playing Miami in the Orange Bowl, and the Orange Bowl was in a pretty rough part of town, and someone had broken into the locker room the week before. So we decided we better stay the night in the locker room. Boy. The Keystone Cops, they raised their hands and said they'd stay. That's just another thing they did over the years. They decided to sleep on the floor of the locker room after driving all the way to Miami, which was about 17 hours. Wow. Slept in the locker room for security reasons. Now that's one of my favorite stories of the road.
That's some dedication. About what year was that? Do you recall?
I think 19. I want to say 19. Let's see, Miami. We played it. I want to say 82 is when I think Bernie Kosar was the quarterback. So when would he have been there? Yeah. The years kind of run together for me at times. So
would that have been during Whit Taylor's time?
It would have been either Whit or the year before Whit started. Right in there, yeah. I remember the game we lost like 42-13. For some reason, scores I can remember. I don't know why, but sure. they stick with me more. But yeah, it was in the early 80s.
And where was the furthest distance you guys had to travel? I know you played out in Colorado. I know we played up at Rutgers in the Meadowlands. But where was some of the furthest distances you guys had to travel?
I would say the furthest, probably Yukon. In my last few years, it seemed like Yukon took the longest because we had our truck broke down. We didn't there. We didn't get there till the next day at like 12 o'clock. Wow. And we had a problem with the windshield wipers went out on the truck. So and it was raining. So we had to stop and wait for that to be serviced, and it set us behind like 2 or 3 hours. So that's probably the longest trip.
You didn't have to reload. You just had to have it serviced or repaired.
Correct. Luckily, The only time we had to reload was back in the days of the box truck. We blew an engine one time. I can't remember if we were going to Maryland or where, but that's the only time we had to reload.
Well, Luke, let's talk about you mentioned earlier with Jay Cutler with the helmet issue. There's thousands of players who've come through, yes. And we all know that athletes can be superstitious.
Yes.
What are some of those things that you recall that are now putting a smile on your face because so-and-so may have been a little bit of a prima donna or may have been a little bit superstitious, that you always knew these things had to happen in his world because of those things?
Well, the funniest one to me is we have an offensive lineman by the name of Rob Monaco. I don't know if you played with Rob or not. Rob
he was a little bit before me.
A little bit before, but you know who I'm speaking of.
I do.
Rob, actually, we would get his shoulder pads ready, and back then the offensive line shoulder pads looked kind of like an oversized hockey pad. They were just padding. There was no plastic epaulets or anything like that. They were just almost like a covered piece of furniture. They had cloth. Well, we would clean them and get the tape on them, but Rob was superstitious, so he had to take his with him because he slept with his shoulder pads.
Really? That's
Yes.
awesome.
And then
That's
he would bring them
awesome.
to the game. He would bring them to the game because he wanted to. I don't know why. He never really told me, and I didn't really want to ask.
Most athletes aren't going to tell you why. Guys, if you're
Right.
just joining us, we've got Luke Wyatt, longtime equipment guru for the program, and Luke is sharing some good stories, and we're talking about superstitions and certain things, and it doesn't have to be just limited to some of the guys on the field. I'm sure you've worked for many coaches or athletic directors or administrators who always had to have things done a certain way, that maybe Bill Kelly was the only guy who could do this, or
Right.
Wayne was the only one. Any other things do you recall?
Well,
Maybe it was
it's
some of
funny.
those crazy kickers or quarterbacks you dealt with.
Oh gosh, yeah, I saw Rob Chura on your show the other day. That was great. I love that. It's funny. Actually, the best one I have is not about one of our coaches, but one of my friends in the business, Chris Matlock, who was at Notre Dame, who wound up going to South Carolina with Lou Holtz. And Lou Holtz had to have, before every game, he had to have a tuna fish sandwich, a strawberry milkshake, and at halftime he had to have another tuna fish sandwich and a chocolate milkshake. That was every ball game. I thought that was so nothing I have besides Jerry DiNardo having to have his coffee, or Coach McIntyre having to have his Hershey bars. It was just little stuff like that with our coaches, but I thought that was kind of odd with Coach Holtz.
Well, that's pretty funny. Those are good stories. And when you had student managers, I don't know if that's still a thing or continued. In my day, my buddy Tyler Chastain, Dwayne, Wade, there's a bunch of guys. There was probably 5 or 6 every year who were there. And I used to hear lots of stories from them on their perspective and how they used to just kind of hide from Kelly and use you as the buffer. And maybe that was common. But Luke, over the years, did that maintain a tradition where there were student managers and they would be the ones maybe on the sidelines during the game that had the responsibility of the headsets for particular coaches and those things? Did that continue to be a thing that was necessary for the program?
Absolutely. What I did, I always felt like whoever my managers were that worked with a coach in practice, that's going to be who they're going to be with on game day. In other words, if whoever worked with the offensive line, if the offensive line coach is on the field, which most of them are, then he's going to have his grease board. He's going to be there with him at all time, have the markers, the colors of the dry erase markers he wants, all those little things. But that's always been a thing. I'm not sure how they do it now in the last couple of years, but until I left there, we always had student managers, but we also had the volunteers that went with us, like the Keystone Cops, and there was about 7 or 8 other guys that were always there to help in whatever we needed with winter coats or rain capes, towels, whatever it may be. But I always kept the students with their coach they worked with at practice.
But by the time you were finishing up the last couple of years, Luke, were the headsets, did they still have the long cords, or had they finally gone cordless?
No, we went cordless in around 98, 99, excuse me. It was during Woody Woodenhofer's last couple of years, I think, we became wireless. Coach Com was came up with this wireless system. They were the first ones, them in Portaphone. And, at the beginning, you had some funny things because you'd wind up getting a pizza guy on the phone.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, because back then you didn't have a band space that you needed. I guess that I don't know all the technicalities of it. I had a headset guy named Buddy Schaefer that took care of it for me. But you had the band space, and so you get bleed over from whatever, especially if you're in a large metropolitan city. We always had trouble when we went to South Carolina because the state fair was always going on.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
Interference, walkie-talkies and stuff. Yeah. But once it became wireless, there was more stress because when something went wrong, the rules became, if your headsets went out, if the visiting team's headsets went out, you had to take yours off. Or if you had a problem with one, you had to take yours off. So it was more stressful. When you had the cords, it was a pain in the rear end, but they were reliable. You never had
I was going to say there was a huge trade-off I know that Dwayne and Tyler and those guys who had responsibilities with their coaches, those
Yes.
cords were everywhere, but
Oh gosh. Yes.
they seem to be the ones that work. But let's switch over a little bit. Still on the sidelines. Most schools, most programs use those crazy boards that have 4 different symbols on them, or numbers, or different things. What was your experience on and watching on the sidelines about what Vanderbilt did, what our sidelines did with those things?
We've run the gamut. Most of those, believe it or not, and coaches want to act like they're all coming up with the great ideas, but most of that stuff's just fake. It means nothing, most of it. The boards we had for defense under James Franklin's, they'd hold up a number or a picture of Jerry Seinfeld or whatever it may be. It absolutely meant nothing. It was just a distraction for someone to think about. Now, I think as time's moved on, they've actually used them for reasons, like a sign in baseball. But most of the time, that's all fluff. It doesn't mean a thing.
Well, I used to get so tickled because on the sidelines when we would call in the plays with signals, it might be Coach Christophel, Tim Richardson, and me all signaling something different. And
Right.
EJ or Gromes is on the field, and they know that, 2 of us are the dummy,
Right.
literally and figuratively. But I used to get so tickled at that, all those funny things. Daryl Griffin says, "What's up, Luke? This is Griff. How you doing, bud?" Thank you, Daryl, for tuning in for a minute. I'm telling you, all kind of names people are popping in from different years, Luke, to give a shout out to you. Luke, let's talk about the bowl games.
Sure.
Historically, up until about 15 years ago, that has not been a major tradition for the program. Only, about 3 or 4 bowl games up until when Coach Johnson took over. But in the last 15 years, there's been 7 or 8 bowl games. So it became pretty regularly that they would play in the Music City, or I got to host a whole bunch of folks when they came down to Birmingham several years ago. That was a lot of fun. But what was it about the bowl games? Because there's a great picture of you holding up, I think maybe the Music City trophy. I can't remember which one it is. But talk about that experience.
Well, I think I was too young to understand how much to enjoy the Peach Bowl when I was 13. So in '82, I actually had to work baseball and wound up driving down on my own to be on the field for the Hall of Fame bowl game. So I didn't get that whole experience for those 2 bowls. But in 2005, when we broke the streak, the 22-year losing streak to Tennessee, that was probably as good as any bowl game I ever been to, because we'd beaten Tennessee finally, and it was in Knoxville. And the abuse and the unwarranted abuse that you guys got from fans in this state is just that meant so much to me. And Coach Johnson gave me the game ball after the game. So that one was probably the most important, or not important, the game I remember the most at Vanderbilt. Now the bowl games, we go in '08 when we went to the Music City.
I called that the hot chocolate bowl game.
Ooh, it was very
My girls and I were there, and it was so brutally cold near the river that I think we spent about $50 on hot chocolates.
Oh,
I'll take it. I'll take that win anytime.
Absolutely. And if you'll remember, that was a defensive battle, and it came down. The MVP was our punter, Brett Upson.
Punter. That's right. That's right.
So, but yeah, just the bowl experience for the kids. Now, you didn't get to leave town, but staying at Opryland at the Gaylord and having all the contests, the rib eating contests and that type of stuff, and the bowling, that's just great. And all it does, it builds team camaraderie and takes you into a very positive, uplifting off season.
And it does. It builds, gives the team some momentum on the inside, and then the kids who are coming into the program or considering it, they see that atmosphere building. Luke, Beth Graves Dodd just came into the talk and says to tell you hello. So hello, thank you, Beth, for tuning in. Let's talk about your coaches, your head coaches. Mm-hmm. There was 11 of them over the years.
There was 2 of them won. Steve Sloan was the head coach when I was a little kid. Of course, I didn't have much interaction. He don't even know you're around when you're 13. Right. But I guess for me, Coach McIntyre would have been the first one that I actually had a relationship with. Mm-hmm. George was a great man. He had a son that played for us, Mike McIntyre. He had another son that played at Western Kentucky named Matt, and I knew the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a good man, a Christian man that I respected. And he did everything he could to win at Vanderbilt. Had Watson Brown as an offensive coordinator, and Watson did an awesome job as an offensive coordinator, and then came in, of course, to be the head coach, as you well know. I'm not sure where you fit in on the recruiting. Who recruited you, if you don't mind my asking that?
Watson was my coach. I was in his first class. That was
Okay.
That was the '86 signing class.
Gotcha. So let's just start with Coach Mack, and then we moved on from Coach Mack to Coach Brown, and that's when that was my first year being the head equipment manager, was with Coach Brown, and he and Coach Shep and some of the other coaches that were around with him were great people as well. I enjoyed it.
I'm surprised that Coach Shep isn't on here. He usually is. He must be busy at the restaurant. I bet he catches this later on. So Coach Shep, thank you for tuning in later on, which I know you will. But I didn't mean to interrupt you. But you're right.
Okay.
That Warhop was part of that. Coach Schmitz, Christophel, Watson. That was all that group right there.
Absolutely, and they wonderful to work for. Very sad day, that Watson's last day when we're playing Tennessee. It was one of my one of the saddest days, because if you'll remember, Tennessee was highly ranked going to the Sugar Bowl back then, which was the premier bowl of the conference then, and we knew before the game that Coach was gone, and it was just it's almost like going to a funeral. It was tough. But I still stay in touch with Watson. He does a radio show here in town with George Plaster, a couple hours a day.
Time to time. And I'm trying to get him on the show, hopefully in the upcoming weeks.
And he hasn't changed a bit. After Coach Brown, it went to Jerry DiNardo. Jerry was very different, came from New York. His dad was walked a beat as a police officer in downtown New York, Midtown Manhattan. He had some great stories, and he and I became very close. Jerry actually asked me to be his head equipment manager when he went to Indiana. Jerry and James Franklin, I compare a lot. They were very similar type coaches, very similar.
Dynamic personalities.
Absolutely, very, very strong-willed. It was kind of the my way or the highway mentality. But you weren't going to outwork them. I would say the two that worked harder than any that ever been there as head coaches were Jerry DiNardo and James Franklin. We'll say that. Bobby Johnson and his staff, again, great people. Bobby Johnson, I still stay in touch with him today. Coach Caldwell, who's at Clemson, was the offensive line coach. He actually was the head coach at Vanderbilt in the interim for 1 year before Franklin at the end of Bobby's career. So I've been so lucky and so fortunate to work with those people. I wouldn't have traded that for anything. And I think some of the assistants on those staffs I still talk to on a weekly basis. Jamie Bryan, I think about him. And then there's so many out there, Bernard. Right now, my mind's going like a
I'm sure it is, Luke.
Yeah.
You know, in when you first were coming around in the late 70s, early 80s, the size of the football administrative staff, compare that, just think in your mind the numbers to 2016, 17, 18, how it has grown in sheer volume.
You know, and that's something that, yes, I don't really understand it either. And maybe you can help me with this. When I first began at Vanderbilt, we had one more sport than we do now because we had men's soccer.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a department of 78 folks.
Mm-hmm.
When I left Vanderbilt, there was like 232. And you're doing the same things. The stadium's not any bigger. Yeah. I know technology you would think would make things easier, but yet there's more people involved. The details of the everyday workaday life was so different when I left. My first staff at Vanderbilt in football, we had, I think, 18 people. That counted trainers, equipment, wait staff. When I left, it was 42.
Luke, it's got to be the volume of the money that's involved.
Correct.
The SEC obligations, I'm sure, have evolved over the years. Dealing with TV, I'm sure there's so much more that goes into the responsibilities of the program. But the sheer volume of football players hasn't changed, I wouldn't think. It may have gone up.
When you were there.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It may have fluctuated a little bit. I don't know how they do walk-ons now. We probably had about 10 walk-ons any given year, maybe less at times, but that was, 30 years ago. But
Right.
it is interesting. You take some of the bigger, I'll call the bigger programs, the typical top 10 teams like in Alabama, Clemson, those programs, they may have upwards of over 100, maybe 140, 130 people. You may know better than I, but it just seems like it's becoming so corporate like, and particularly in our conference, being the leading conference for this sport, and probably for most other sports as well. It just seems like it's just so much bigger than it ever has been.
Well, when autonomy hit, which I'm not sure what year that was, I want to say around 2011
Hmm.
for football, it became, and you'll remember this, your old banana sweats you had. Uh,
Still have
you
them.
got one pair, and that was it.
Yeah, yeah.
Now you can actually give the players 4 sets of sweats if you want to. You
Wow.
can, there's autonomy now. They get a brand new pair of gloves every game. You get a new pair of shoes every other game if you need it, whatever it needs
Oh,
to
I
be.
can remember Bill Kelly when he gave us our new turfs. This is your pair. This is all you get for the year. Don't screw it up.
Listen, you'll love this. I got to tell this quick story.
Uh-huh.
You brought it out. Brad Gaines, he
My
was,
class, my year,
yes,
86.
Brad was changing positions. So he calls me because he knew Bill Kelly wouldn't do it. He said, Luke, meet me in stall 3 with another pair of shoulder pads. I'm changing positions.
Oh, that's so awesome.
But
That's so awesome.
we absolutely, nowadays, the kids don't want for anything as far as equipment goes. And that's great. I wish it would have been that way for you guys because I used to have to pick and choose who could get gloves at times because the budget was such bare bones in the 80s.
Well, at the time when I came on board, um, Beth said she was always begging Luke for player sweats.
This is true.
Yeah. Luke, I can remember Roy Kramer was our AD when I came on. And before I started in the fall of 86, I did lots of reading about the program. I knew about Witt and Kurt and all those great passers that preceded the years and the receivers and some of the success. But I certainly knew about Coach Kramer and his coaching career and then becoming on. And this is the story I'm going to tell you is when I first met Coach Kramer. It was when I signed and then I came up for a visit. Watson offered me in January, and then I came back later in the spring. And I saw Coach Kramer, and I was petrified. I was terrified to even say hello to the man. Well, he caught me before I saw him, and he introduced himself. He knew who I was. I'm like, how does this man? I'm not anything special. I just happen to be part of the next class. Well, he was so detail oriented and knew what he was doing and had done it for so long. I mean, he even knew me by sight. And I was so impressed with that. And it always just stuck with me. What a great leader he was, leading the program and then later leading the SEC.
Let me say this: of all the athletic directors that I worked under, he was the best by far.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a close second, and
Yeah.
that's not to criticize the other men, but Rory Kramer was a pro in every sense of the word. You knew where you stood. I never had to guess about anything budget wise. If I needed something and I need to go to him or Bill Kelly need to go to him, you may not like the answer, but you got an answer. It wasn't, well, we'll wait and see, or we'll do this. He said, yes, we're doing it, or no, that's not important enough. We're not going to do it. And I always respected it. He was awesome.
He also got me, we used to have to stay Thanksgiving week because that was the Tennessee
Right.
week. So we'd have Thanksgiving together on campus, one of the cafeterias, usually maybe Branscombe, I can't really remember. He walks up to me and hands me a knife and a fork, and he says, "You're a quarterback. You get to cut the turkey." And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. What does this have to do with what position I play? David Kropp says his son at Brentwood Academy gets more swag in 1 week than we used to get in an entire season.
I
I
don't
wouldn't doubt
doubt
that
that.
at all.
I don't doubt that at all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Luke, we're getting close toward the end of our conversation, and my friend, this this, at least for me, has been a great walk down memory lane. You were such an instrumental part of my years there, and you've been that way for so many hundreds of other guys who've come through that program. I want to leave you with, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I'm going to throw some things to you, and you just tell me what first comes to mind, okay?
Okay.
All right. Boo Mitchell. What comes to mind?
You can see my arms.
That's right. Making the L after a big catch.
L for Linda, his friend Linda. I think her name was.
That's right.
That's the first thing. And great hands, that's for sure.
Yeah. Ralph Webb.
Ralph Webb, tough as pig iron.
Playing in Knoxville at Neyland Stadium.
Makes you sick to your stomach.
I don't think I could have said that one any better myself. Having to deal with the opposing team's equipment managers and your counterparts when they would come into to Vanderbilt to play.
A pleasure for the most part. There a couple of bad experiences in all those years, so it was great. It was great. Love all those guys. Still keep in touch with a lot of them.
You've told us about your favorite all-time game. That was the Tennessee game, the victory in 05. Give me one more great memory before we conclude. Give me either on the field, off the field, just something that always puts a smile on your face.
Well, this is one I tell everyone, and it wasn't in victory. It was in a loss in Knoxville. But it was what Coach McIntyre said to our team after we lost 38 to, I believe, 36 on a blown call in the end zone, or we'd have beat Tennessee that year.
Go ahead.
You may have been in that locker room. I can't remember.
Yeah, it was Coach Brown.
Well, after the game, he says you can hear the roaring because the crowd, there was where they could come down by the locker room, you could hear them yelling and screaming or whatever. And he made the statement, if I had to do it all over again, every time I want to be in this locker room than the one at the other end of this stadium. Mm-hmm. And that always stuck with me because I thought that was the best way to put it, best way to say it, because there's something you, and I'm talking to you now, Bernard, you and every other player that's ever put on the black and gold should be so proud because of what you do and what you did at Vanderbilt. Forget the wins and losses. It's the fact that what you had to do when you had to go to class, and you had to go to class, and they wanted you to be Harvard Monday through Friday, and they wanted you to be Alabama on Saturday. And that's why I'm so proud of every one of those kids, and including you.
Well, Luke, thank you on behalf of myself and any others who are watching or went through this program. That's what's made you so special for all these guys all these years. And my friend, it's been a pleasure speaking with you for this hour, and even more importantly, just being a friend of yours and being in contact with you all these years. And I hope to see you in person very soon.
Very soon. Thank you so much for having me, and I love all you guys.
Absolutely,
and
guys.
You too, Beth.
She says, well said. Not that part, but what you just said about all the players. But, guys, this will conclude us for another Conversations with Commodores, Luke Wyatt, equipment man extraordinaire, black and gold through and through. Thank you, guys, and I'll be signing off for now, and we'll catch you with another call, another talk, another chat, another time.